So in this third installation of Morgan Revealed, we get into the regenerative receiver itself. We'll be building this right-to-print a radio book for boys, and some of the early editions of the boys' first book of radio and electronics show the 1H4 tube or a type 30 tube, and we'll be using them in this regenerative receiver. Stand by, this is part 3, the Regen receiver, Morgan style. So we want to build a Morgan Regen. One issue is the Morgan Regen is not just one circuit. As Morgan continues to write different books about regeneration, the tube era continues to evolve, and he starts out using some of the very early tubes like the type 300 and the 201, from the early 20s, and then he transitions into the type 30, and then finally to the 1H4 shown here, and then he goes to the 6BF6 and so on. One thing that all of these tubes have in common is their low to medium mu gain tube. And this is a big key when you're designing a regenerative receiver. You want the tube to have low gain because that allows the regeneration to be more smooth when you're adjusting this control. So whatever the tube you use, don't put in a high mu triode like a 12AX7 or it's not going to work as well. So we're of course familiar mostly with the 1961-62 edition of the boys' first book of radio and electronics. This is the one that does have the 6BF6 tube. I've got a couple of videos on this and how to tame it. You might want to check out those videos. This is just a little sample of what we've done with that tube. We've put in a throttle capacitor, added a proper choke and a transformer in the output. Not really what this video is about, but I just wanted to show you what I've done with that 1961-62 version of the boys' first book. I even tried a 6CB6 with a regeneration control in the screen grid. So we're not really going to be dealing with this particular receiver, but we'll use it for comparison purposes only. Instead, we're focusing on the 1954 edition of the boys' first book of radio and electronics. The 54 edition is the one that has the 1H4 tube. We'll be building this up. I'm kind of showing you the books and the schematics up front. That's kind of reverse what I normally do, but I wanted to get these schematics out to you quickly, and I will be putting them up in the Facebook page that I maintain, the Microwave One Radio Resources page. The next book we're going to go through a little bit is called Getting Acquainted with Radio. This is a 1940 edition, and here's what the Regen looks like. He's using a type 30 tube. This is a battery triode that you might find all through the 30s, and these would have been fairly easy to get your hands on. So that's what he designed around. We will also be building this Regen. Then the 1940 edition of the Boy Electrician. It has a similar Regen, this time using a type 30 tube. Notice the 00025 bypass capacitor and the swamping resistor used for the regeneration control across the feedback. Very interesting. In order to hear the regenerative receiver, I will be using my simple battery-powered amplifier. This uses a couple of battery tubes from the 50s. The 1U5 hooked up as a triode. We have a triode connection here. And the 3V4 power output tube driving a small speaker. This is running on 45 volts for the B+. It makes its own bias because we float the ground, and we have a 1.5 volt battery that's going to be lighting up the amplifier. So that was all of the schematics kind of up front for you. Let's build a regen. So I want to pull on this amplification factor / transconductance thread just a little bit further before we get started. Back in 1920, the UV200 gas tube was developed as a detector. And later on, the 300 came along in 1924. This is the one that Morgan was using in his first regen. And these are very, very good regen tubes. They've got gas inside, an alkali vapor that allows the regen circuit to work at its absolute best. It allows the control to operate very close to the oscillating point. So what I'm saying is basically these gas tubes that were developed in the very early 20s are probably the ultra when it comes to regenerative receivers. And they probably, at least for the gentleness of going into regeneration, beat anything that's out there today. Now, of course, he quickly changed to the Type 30 battery tube. Again, this is a low transconductance and a low amplification factor tube, an excellent choice for a regen. And we know that the 1H4 has the same exact ratings as the Type 30. It's just a repackaged Type 30 and an octal base. Now, if we go to the 6BF6, the next tube that he selects, you can see that it's fairly still low amplification factor and transconductance, but it is higher than all the previous tubes, and this guy will tend to go into regeneration a little bit more harshly than those other older tubes. Now, the 6C4 is a very popular tube to use in modern regeneratives, and it has a fairly low transconductance and amplification factor. It's not as low as some of the other tubes we talked about, but it's still very good. I think you'd find the 12AU7 would also be an excellent candidate. However, when we get to the 12AX7, the transconductance jumps way up and the amplification factor comes along with it. So this would not be a good tube to try with a regen. So collecting the parts for the one-tube regenerative receiver that Morgan outlines in a couple of his earlier books, First Radio Book for Boys and the Boys' First Book of Radio and Electronics, there's kind of a crossover point where he's going from the Type 30 battery triode to the 1H4 battery triode. They're basically the same tube. One is in a 4-pin and one is in an octal pin. So he makes that transition during the 40s between the kind of the 1930s style tube to the 1940s style tube. But when he finally goes into the later editions of the Boys' First Book of Radio, he transitions into the miniature 6BF6 triode, which is kind of strange. It's a 6.3 volt, designed for auto radios mostly, but it seems to have similar characteristics, triodes, which work good with regens. And so I can see why he picked the 6BF6 when he went to the miniature tube, but it was a difficult tube to find, at least for me as a kid. I ended up having to go to a TV and radio repair guy, and my dad had to shell out the money, which was a ridiculous price for the tube. I could have used any one of the tubes in my junk pile at that point, but of course I was trying to follow the book exactly. And as you look at these parts, you're going to say, oh, I can't possibly find half of the parts you've got on this table. The first thing I was wondering about is, am I ever going to be able to find a 250 picofarad capacitor for the bypass? It turned out my junk box was full of them. I have plenty of those 250 puff postage stamp style capacitors. I found a couple of 100 picofarad postage stamps for the grid leak, and a grid leak resistor that's around 2.1
meg. It's not exactly 2.2, but it's going to work okay. Here's the on-off switch regen pot. I disagree with his use of the high value, like a 1 meg pot, in another case a 500K pot. I think the feedback adjustment potentiometer should be more like 10K or 15K. A lower value works better, for me at least, with the Armstrong style of feedback regeneration. I'm just using ordinary phenolic sockets that would be scavenged out of the radios of the day. Then the other complaint is I'll never find any plug-in coil forms. These are hard to find. I'll give you that. There are people reproducing plug-in coil forms. You can take advantage of that. I like to take old tube base, from tubes that are no good, take the 4-pin base off, and you can build a very nice coil around that base, and it works out okay. And you can even make it look pretty if you want to do a little extra work, but don't get hung up with the plug-in coil idea. Anyway, some of you are going to have problems finding some of these parts. Here's the 2 trimmers. Other of you will have these in your junk box. Remember, I'm just trying to build in a period style with the parts that a kid would have had in the early 40s.
There are a couple of obvious mistakes that we can take care of right now. The regeneration control as well as the bypass capacitor are wrong on the schematic, in my opinion, and also connecting the wiper to the stationary on the tickler coil. The dots are there, but the lines were never drawn.
So a lot of you guys are saying, well, that stuff's all easy, but where am I going to find the variable capacitor and this fancy dial? Well, I'll let you know when I'm no longer finding these parts at ham flea markets, but I can tell you I found a couple of these, and I found some variable capacitors, $2 each, at the Ham Fest just a month ago. Straight line variable cap. Look at that shape on that. Straight line variable means that it puts the low frequencies and the high frequencies all at equal markings on the dial.
Now, straight line frequency variable capacitors are not all the same because they have to be carefully calibrated to the inductance that they're used against. So just because you have a straight line frequency variable doesn't mean that you're going to get an absolutely perfect scale, but it certainly gets you a lot closer than the run-of-the-mill variable.
Again, these parts are hard to find, but they're not impossible to find. And again, I'm trying to build in the style of the 1940s using parts of the 1930s. So as with the first regenerative receiver that I built with the 6BF6, basically you need to cut out a panel out of masonite. I used an ordinary clipboard, and in this case there was some masonite that I actually cut out with a hacksaw and then rubbed it down with a little bit of sandpaper, and I'll probably put a coat of polyurethane on the front of this. As far as the chassis goes, I'm trying to follow the instructions of the older book, which is approximately this size. And this is some flashing that I got at Home Depot. I'm going to put flashing in back of the panel. Any regen could benefit from that. Now, the original one I built did not have the flashing. Okay, you can build it. But I've found that if you do use flashing in back of the panel, it improves the hand capacity issue. Now, that may get you in trouble with these 2 phone clips. You have to use some shoulder washers there to make sure that you don't short those out with the backer that you're putting on there, as well as the trimmers. Nothing fancy about the piece of wood here. I just put a little bit of polyurethane that had some stain in it.
So I'm going to let you guys go through this at your own leisure. This is, of course, the instructions on how to build the one-tube regen out of the Boy's First Book of Radio and Electronics. And this is just a little review excerpt. Go through the parts list and see what you can find. Tick them off. Start collecting. This will allow you to begin to get confidence that you can have enough parts to start the project. You're going to be looking for a nice vernier dial, of course, of some kind. The one that I showed is just one of the many types of 1920s and 30s verniers that are out there. And of course the coils are interesting. Tube sockets and coils are always something that people struggle with. Mounting and winding the coils is always interesting. Here's the layout of on the board, and I pretty much followed this with my construction, as you're going to see. Getting the Phonostock clips and everything mounted on the front panel, getting the sockets mounted, dealing with the 2.5 millihenry choke. This is pretty well covered in the book, and I think that, you know, wiring the receiver, he gives you a nice pictorial drawing. This is going to help you to check your wiring. Working with batteries, the 9-volt stack of batteries to produce 45 volts. So you need 5 9-volt batteries to produce 45 volts for the B+. Not a big deal today. And the 1H4, of course, runs on 2 volts, but a lot of people just run it on 1.5 volt D cell. I'm running mine on a couple of AA's, and later on you'll see I add a rheostat to bring that down so I can control the heater. He even has a troubleshooting guide included in the book, which is really helpful for kids. Now, on winding the coils, I found that when I wound the coils to his exact specifications, that this 150 turns got me well below the AM band, down to around 500 kilohertz and even lower, and it didn't really cover the upper part of the band at all. It barely got up to 1 megahertz. And then the second coil that he suggests, the 70 and 20, it covers kind of the top end of the broadcast band up to about 2 or 3 megahertz.
So looking at the front panel layout, we have the antenna trimmers on the left, the regeneration control on the right, the 2 phone connectors, which are Phonostock clips, and of course the vernier dial. So next I like to kind of lay things out on the chassis and see if we're forgetting anything. Yeah, notice we've got a couple terminal strips, one for the grid leak assembly and one over here that seems to be a tie point. And we might need more, but this is a start. I'm going to start with the 1H4 tube, which is an octal. And of course this is the plug-in coil socket. The nice thing about this for the kid is you're not going to accidentally plug the type 30 tube into the plug-in coil socket, or plug the plug-in coil accidentally into the tube socket, because we have an octal and a 4-pin. But of course he did start by using the type 30 tube in his earlier books. In the updated editions, he flips over to the 1H4 octal. It's equivalent to the 30. It's also a battery tube. The holes are now drilled in the back plate, both for the variable capacitor and for the registration screw for the vernier. Potentiometer goes over here, and these are the mounting points, the headphones, the 2 trimmers. Should be all set to mount the front panel next. Okay, the front panel's on. We can begin to mount the major components, and I would suggest checking the capacitor to make sure that the holes are registered right, and putting that on later once you get everything nested in there, make sure that the capacitor's not going to crowd anything, especially the RF choke. So I have gone ahead and mounted the major parts on the chassis and the front panel. Front panel is complete. Everything is mounted, and now it's time to choose some wire and wire it up. But before I go that far, I wanted to show you some of the features of some of these components. The first one I want to cover is the Phonostock clip. Now these Phonostock clips that I got hold of are old school. As you can see, it's solid brass, and this clip has some really interesting features. First of all, it's really stiff, and this is a really strong clip with a big way to hold the wire. It has a built-in solder lug on the back, and better than that, it's got two little tabs that are folded down that dig into the chassis or the wood so that it doesn't start wandering back and forth as you're screwing it in. This is an excellent Phonostock clip. This is what we want right here, if you can find these. Let me show you an example of a poor Phonostock clip. You guys might recognize this. This is the shortwave crystal set. These were some that I picked up on Amazon Prime, pretty cheap. They're nice and silver. They've been plated with something. They solder fine, they mount fine, but they just are tough to use. I find it almost impossible to get the wires to work in them without something bending. They're too flimsy. Not happy with these. So it's just a matter of manufacturing, that's all. These old ones were manufactured with a process that was probably patented, and the newer ones are just something that looks right, even if it doesn't work the best. The other thing, I noticed on the schematic they were calling for a 250 picofarad capacitor. That's the bypass capacitor from the plate circuit down to ground, and we call this the throttle capacitor. But on this pictorial it's showing a 0025, a 0.0025. Now that's a big difference. And what would that affect? Both of them would work. Both of those capacitors, even though they're wildly different, would work in the regen. But the problem is the number of turns on the tickler coil would have to change pretty radically to make one work or the other work. With the heavy bypass shown here, the 0025, you wouldn't need that many turns. But with the 250 picofarad or the 0025, you'd probably need to put half as many, again, turns on there to get it to oscillate properly. By the way, the 250 picofarad would be the better value and would give you the smoothest regeneration. This 0025 is going to give quite a harsh regeneration. It's going to come in really quick. So the question is, which is right? And also on the mounting of the variable capacitor, I was lucky and found a couple of these vernier dials which I restored. These two were not really in bad shape, but it did come out pretty well. I have the backing panel, grounding panel on there. That went okay. I made a few mistakes here and there on the mounting. I had the tube sockets a little too close to the capacitor, so I moved them back a little bit. Let's look at the front panel. Turn this around. Let's come down so we can see things a little better. Now, as you can see, I've got a pretty glossy front panel. And that was done because I was scratching things up, I was making a mess, and I decided just to put in a few coats of polyurethane on there. So it's not a glass finish, but it's certainly, you know, it's getting toward a mirror finish on there. Also, let's look down at the tuning capacity. These dials are tricky. You have to learn how to use them, And the only thing that keeps them from rotating on the shaft is this little depression right here. So you have to have something on the front panel that goes into that snugly, or the thing will just wander around like this. So that is the front surface mount that allows this thing to remain stationary as you tune. Okay, so as you tune this thing, you don't want this thing to go as you tune, right? You want that fixed, and you want just the dial and the center to move. Okay, so that's what that little thing is that holds the dial in place. That was a screw that came through the front panel with a little bit of a rubber collar around it that gives it a little bit of support, and it doesn't slop back and forth. Now remember, we have the linear in frequency variable capacitor. Okay. Now getting that to turn freely and correctly is going to take a little playing. You have to get used to these dials and how they work. But I'm telling you, this is a nice setup. If you can get something like this working, this is going to be an ideal regenerative receiver. And we should be able to do pretty much the whole broadcast band with one sweep of the dial, and it should be fairly linear if we wind the coil right. The other thing, the actual on-off potentiometer I'm using is not the proscribed 500K or 1 meg pot, which I think is ridiculously high in the Alfred Morgan design. It's more like a 5 or 10K pot. Okay, I'll measure this, but I think it might even be a 5K pot. But lower value is better for smooth regeneration in the style that we're using here, without the throttle capacitor. Of course, a throttle capacitor will give you the best performance. And same goes for the trimmers. A trimmer capacitor that has a knob will be better than these things. But I'm trying to build it as close as possible to the design from the early 40s.
Okay, in part 4, we're going to finish up the wiring. We're going to wind some coils, and we're actually going to hear some stations. So stand by. Part 4 of Morgan.